No, thank you for having me here, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be not only speaking at IOCS, but also to be speaking on the feast day of such a saint as St. Catherine. So just a little bit about me. I hold an undergraduate degree in classics and a doctorate in modern Greek literature, and I mostly work on folk narrative these days. I spent 10 years in corporate communications at a Fortune 20 financial services company. I'm also an editor and an organizational consultant. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a colleague, and as you can probably tell, an American. Yeah. So I'm also the founder and head, as Razvan said, of Axia Women, which is why I'm speaking to you today. So years ago, I read a book by neurologist Dr. Oliver Sacks. He was a British doctor who had a gift for weaving together humanity and science in his popular work, which generally focused on individuals with neurological disorders. Great, if you change the slide. One, that's it, that's great. One of his subjects in one of his books was Temple Grandin. She's an American professor and an animal behaviorist who has autism. She calls herself an anthropologist on Mars because of how alien humans, as opposed to animals, seem to her. And if you would change that slide again, great. The idea of being an anthropologist on Mars really stuck with me. Sometimes I try to look at things I know very well and think about them as though I were an alien with a deep interest in some human institution or other, although I suppose it must have been far more interesting to be an extraterrestrial investigator 50 years ago. Today, if one of them came to watch us, they might mostly see us go to work to look at computer screens, walking between places looking at screens in our hands, or sitting at home at night looking at TV screens. But if one of them got tired of trying to understand all the screen watching and decided to do a special study of our Orthodox churches, focusing on the American kinds, which are the ones that I know best, what would their impressions be, do you think? Fortunately, the first thing they notice is that we're not looking at electronic screens. They go through the door and they notice the colors of the icons on the walls and the sounds of the choir, and they'd smell the incense rising. They notice women and men going through the external doors, but not really enough people to fill the space or the pews, because most American churches have adopted those. They notice that the percentage of children isn't as high as they would expect from looking at families in the outside world. They notice most people lighting candles, and they begin to realize that men with beards and some boys go into the sacred space behind the iconostasis. They see men, probably not with beards, doing things around the church building. Things like reading special texts, carrying candles, setting up the lectern so that the priest can read from a really big book covered in metal, adding lumps of incense to a metal bowl that was then swung around, helping while people line up for communion, greeting people at the door, taking money, all those liturgical tasks. They notice that most of our liturgical services have no active physical participation from the women and girls who form at least half the congregation. They'd start to wonder what all that means. They'd notice that the painted pictures on the walls, the icons, depict far more male figures than female. And they'd see the same thing if they looked at photographs of the parish itself, which mostly show men and boys wearing vestments. If they ask around, they'd find out that sometimes girls and women had tried to do some liturgical task or other, carry a candle in a procession, or read a text aloud, maybe, but a bishop heard a complaint and made them stop. If our alien had any sort of linguistic abilities, they'd notice that the English language used in that church setting was very different in important ways from standard English. In the world of secular English, as has been the case for at least 40 years, the word man is no longer generally accepted to mean human being, but has narrowed to mean male person. And of course, that the word brethren has never meant sisters and brothers, just as the word fathers has never meant mothers and fathers. And they probably conclude that all the texts read aloud in the service addressing brethren and invoking fathers and men mean that the liturgy itself is being addressed solely to the men in the room. And they might begin to wonder why the women are there at all, as witnesses. And they'd probably make a note to do some follow-up interviews. So at some point, they'd probably find out that most priests and laity think that females of any age have to be banned from the sacred space of the altar no matter what. And that once a month, women who menstruate have to be banned from communion and sometimes even from church entirely. That they are periodically unclean in a way that men apparently are not. They might begin to draw the conclusion that a lot of churchgoers think that there's something deeply wrong with women and something deeply right about men. But because they're trying to be a good anthropologist, they'd probably also look at other textual evidence. If they did their background research, they would know that the Assembly of Bishops in the United States had long ago approved a version of the Nicene Creed that doesn't use exclusionary language, but that most churches haven't bothered to adopt it, although it makes the linguistically accurate and theologically sound point that Christ came as a human being rather than as a male man. And that would make sense to our anthropologist, because it would confirm their growing hypothesis that the church really is for the benefit of the males in the community that they're studying. I suspect our anthropologist from Mars would go away puzzled at why so many women and girls show up for these rituals that are so clearly intended for men and boys. I doubt they'd be surprised that our American churches are experiencing what has been called a silent schism. That is, when our girls are old enough, they simply stop going to Orthodox worship. They find other things to do on Sundays. And I know something that our anthropologist hasn't yet found out, which is the surprising number of faithful Orthodox women who actually love the Orthodox faith, life, and church, who have found themselves pushed out of their communities one way or another. Some of them have undertaken a kind of secular diaconate. Some have been ordained to some kind of ministerial role in a different church. Some stay home and read the Bible and the fathers on their own. And the rest are still struggling to find a constructive way forward. Our Martian anthropologist would be very surprised to learn that there have been growing calls for a revival of the ministry, the women's diaconate, that would have as one of its primary roles the care of women. And they'd also be surprised that there's a lot of enthusiasm around that prospect. They would be far less surprised that a lot of people object to even the idea of deaconesses in their midst, and say so openly and online in some really ugly ways. The anthropologist almost definitely won't hear that Christ, whom all people who call themselves his followers are supposed to imitate, that Christ loved, trusted, and relied on the women in his life. You can change the slide. So, as you may remember, I am part of Axia Women, and we are here to say that the anthropologist on Mars has got it wrong, even though we understand why all of their careful and accurate observations may have led them to some wrong conclusions. The church is intended for the salvation of all human beings, not just for the guys among us. The body of Christ is crucially made up of women and men, girls and boys. Our role as human beings, as we're told over and over in the New Testament, is to create the kingdom of heaven on earth. Axia Women believes all those things. But we are small, and no anthropologist from any planet has ever come knocking at our door to hear that story. So if you'll bear with me a little longer, I'll tell you why I wish they had. We're a network by, for, and about Orthodox women in the service of Christ. We got our start after we surveyed women leaders in the church and heard them say over and over how much they needed a network to combat the isolation caused by their church work. We spend most of our time finding out about Orthodox women in the United States. It's a demographic that virtually no one else is studying, and making women's work in the church visible and their voices heard. You can change the slide. We make use of social media. This is our Instagram. This is what you'll see if you look at our Instagram account. We have a website, and we use email for blasts. Our experience of women is that they're always in motion. They're always making They're always working to make things happen. We find ways for women to tell their stories in their own words. We post photographs of them in action. We also organize events for women to speak about their areas of expertise directly to our audience. So what does this entail? Would you change the slide? So each week, our social media features a new Woman of the Week. Here's one example, Helen Theodoropoulos. It's a series that has so far highlighted more than 120 women from Eastern and Oriental jurisdictions across the United States. They are a wide variety of ages, ethnic groups, professions. They get nominated by people who admire them and their work. They include monastics, priest wives, recent and longtime converts, as well as people who have been in the church all their lives. We ask them to tell about what they do and how they ended up doing it, so that girls and young women can see ways forward in the church. Because we hear so often girls in church saying, you know, there's no role for me. They tell, our Women of the Week, they tell about an area of their expertise, and they tell us their morning routine, which helps ground their experiences in the real world and also shows us that there's no one way to be an Orthodox Christian. Helen Theodoropoulos, hers was particularly affecting because one of the things that came out is that she has undergone cancer a couple of times, and she talks about the kind of prayer that really helped get her through that situation. So their stories also show us diverse jurisdictions that are filled with women of action, energy, creativity, and generosity. And we really want the anthropologists from Mars to see that part of the church. Several times a year, we offer webinars or panel discussions. Let's see. You can see there's a webinar here. There's a panel discussion over there. Topics have included integrating girls and boys into the liturgy with Dr. Teva Ragul. These are webinars. There was a straight talk about American Indians and Orthodox Christianity with Dr. Rebecca Hernandez. Church historian and religious studies professor Dr. Nadezhda Kizenko answered questions about confession. Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost answered questions about menstruation. We asked panelists from the Ukrainian Church, the Coptic Church, the Orthodox Church in America, and the Greek Archdiocese to talk about what a vibrant life in the church looks like. 4 women chaplains from the Greek Archdiocese, the Orthodox Church in America, the Ethiopian Church, and Antiochian Church talked to us and each other about how to accompany the sick. 5 women theologians and church historians, each from a different Eastern or Oriental church, talked to us and to each other about how their vocation as scholars impacts their life and the church. Most recently, just last month, 4 women, each from a different Oriental or Eastern church who practice different kinds of pilgrimage, talk to us and each other about how this spiritual practice works in their lives. We also bring women together in fellowship gatherings to create quiet times in one another's company. We ask priests and hierarchs to tell us about the women in their lives who influence their spirituality and their decisions. In fact, you can see Bishop Irene Dobrjevich here, who was speaking about his godmother in the Serbian church. We ask women to tell us about their relationships with women saints, even as we take a fresh look at saints that you think you might know well. And you can see Miho Ochiaili talking about the saint. Her name saint is actually Saint Pelagia. And when she did some digging, she discovered there's not one, but 2 Saint Pelagias that are celebrated on the same day. And she actually did a beautiful job pulling those 2 stories together. And since today we are celebrating IOCS patron saint, I thought you'd like to hear one of our reflections, this one about St. Catherine herself. I didn't write it. This comes from someone who's been writing for us. Her name is Jenna Funkhauser. She lives and works in Oregon and the States and often writes for us. So, Razvan, would you forward the slide? From her youth, she was a flame. She burned bright with the fire of knowledge, the thirst for truth. She glowed with an intensity that drew others into her light. But she didn't just want to shine. She wanted to live in the light of something larger than herself. Then came the moment that St. Catherine's illustrious birth, famed beauty, and intellectual brilliance had prepared her for all her life. Born into the riches of Alexandria during the reign of Emperor Maximian, 305 to 313, St. Catherine had a father who was the governor of this center of Hellenistic knowledge and culture. Her hungers were formed by the greatest scientists, philosophers, and poets of the age. By the time she was 18, one text writes, even the most learned scholars were in awe of her intellectual accomplishments and beauty. Yet she told her parents she would accept no one's hand in marriage who could not surpass her in them all. So imagine her surprise when one weathered old man offers her the substance of her illusions mirrored back at her. Bid by her mother to visit a great spiritual elder living outside the city, she spoke with him only to have that flaming desire kindled within her, as he described a man who did indeed surpass her in all riches, wisdom, and beauty. She carries home an icon of this man and his mother, her heart white hot with desire for truth. Yet that night, seeing them appear before her, Christ turns his face away. Could it be that this vision, this rejection that she faced, was the first time she had faced the limits of her own powers? Could it be Christ knew that her hunger needed a new challenge worthy of its opponent, worthy of her whole life? Either way, a door opens inside her. She walks through. She does not look back. St. Catherine returns to the elder, is catechized and baptized. Again, the Theotokos and her child appear to her, and this time Christ does not look away. St. Catherine would go on to stand before Emperor Maximian himself, bearing witness to the fire that had been lit anew in her, inviting others into its light. Over 200 would join her in the witness of martyrdom. After her death, St. Catherine's relics are believed to have been carried by angels to Mount Sinai, where a monastery in her name encircles the ancient burning bush, a poignant image of this fire that inhabited her without consuming her, carrying truth as the Theotokos carried her child. Perhaps even now she burns brightest for those who hunger for wisdom and knowledge, who never stop seeking the light of something greater than themselves. Holy Mother Catherine, pray to God for us. We certainly need her prayers, at least on Axia's side. If you would forward the slide. Oh, and this slide is included because it's one of my absolute favorite images of girls rejoicing in Christ in the church. They're on pilgrimage and they've gone and gotten a traditional tattoo in Jerusalem. And the photo was taken by Arpi Nakashian, who's the director of online education at St. Vladimir's. So because Axia operates mostly on the internet, and the internet is vast, it's loud, it's a chaotic place, it often feels as though we hold our events or post our pieces and that no one really notices. But every now and then we get reactions. And here are just two examples. Catherine Caron-McRae, who earned a doctorate from the University of Toronto, wrote to us, "For many young women scholars, we came up being told we were alone, as though the long legacy of female saints ended in antiquity, and today women leaders are all individual anomalies. I remember being told by colleagues outside the Orthodox tradition that I was an oppressed person, and even though I had an ideal formation in parishes that nourished and encouraged me, I started to wonder, do I have a vocation in the Orthodox Church?" Axia Women represents the modern ministries of Orthodox women alongside the profiles of saints. For me, this emphasizes how integrated we are into the normal rhythms of a live, vibrant Orthodox Church. When we view history as the work of men, as if ordained persons are the core of the faith instead of the laity, the faith of women becomes secondary. But if we view the church as a whole, as conciliar and collaborative, we can begin to reintegrate the work that women are already doing into the larger unbroken history of women's leadership. Axia reflects how women of faith have always been moving and shaping tradition, and we still do today. Our Instagram followers tend to be a little younger than Kate. They tend to be in their mid-20s and 30s. And one of them, Chelsea Abrea, wrote, "Thank you for making Orthodox women visible. Seeing the diversity of talents, hobbies, phenotypes, prayer rules, and lifestyles has helped me to value my existence and to see my work in the world as the extension of the church. From every woman of the week, I learned that holiness is not mimicked, imitated, or replicable, and that I can be richly textured and multidimensional in how I embody and practice the commandments of Christ. I am growing much more capable of allowing myself to be the icon of Christ than I am. There are some days I find myself wishing that our anthropologists from Mars would not rest on their current observations, but would revisit our churches sometime in the future. That's because we are beginning to see some positive developments happening in America. One major item is being led by the archons, and the Greek Archdiocese, I don't know if they exist here, it honors its most influential layman with the title of archon. There's no equivalent role for women. They're all men. But the archons have put together a committee on increasing the roles of women in the church. The overall sense is that the committee wouldn't be happening without hierarchical approval, and that it might be acting as a kind of temperature check for grassroots attitudes, which is an important step in making changes in the church. There's a rising number of women scholars who are poised to have an effect, not only from our seminaries, but also from programs at Harvard University, Fordham University, and other divinity schools and graduate institutions. The Spirit is working in all sorts of ways. And if you'll bear with me just a little bit longer, I'd like to end with a litany that we often say at Axia. And if you wouldn't mind, one last slide change. And let me just... We walk in the company of the women who have gone before, mothers of the faith, both named and unnamed, testifying with ferocity and faith in the spirit of wisdom and healing. They are the judges, the prophets, the martyrs, the warriors, poets, lovers, and saints who are near to us in the shadow of awareness, in the crevices of memory, and the landscape of our dreams. We walk in the company of Deborah, who judged the Israelites with authority and strength. We walk in the company of Esther, who used her position as queen to ensure the welfare of her people. We walk in the company of the woman with the flow of blood, who audaciously sought her healing and release. We walk in the company of Mary Magdalene, who wept at the empty tomb until the risen Christ appeared. We walk in the company of Phoebe, who led an early church in the Empire of Rome. We walk in the company of Christina the Astonishing, who resisted death with persistence and wonder. We walk in the company of Walata Petros, who helped mobilize a large following of nonviolent resistors to preserve her church in Ethiopia. We walk in the company of Arsam Cook, Matushka Olga, whose loving service and care for people in distress extended far beyond her own village in Alaska. We walk in the company of Perpetua and Felicity, young mothers who cared for one another even as they were being martyred together. We walk in the company of Macrina, who taught her brothers to be great saints and teachers. We walk in the company of Fotini, the Samaritan woman, who loved her community so much that she ran to take the news of Christ to them, even though they did not want to accept it from her. And she loved people so much that she carried the good news with her around the known world. We walk in the company of Demiana, who founded a great monastery near Cairo, and whose 40 nuns joined her in defying an emperor. We walk in the company of Marina the monk, who deeply understood the communal nature of both brokenness and salvation. We walk in the company of the Canaanite woman, the only person to argue with Christ and win. We walk in the company of Egeria, the first female pilgrim to courageously travel across Europe to the Holy Land. We walk in the company of the myrrh-bearing women who went in mourning to the tomb to care for the body of Christ and discovered that he lives. We walk in the company of Etheldreda, the queen and founding abbess of a monastic community for both women and men in Ely. We walk in the company of you whose names have been lost and silenced, who cradled the wisdom of the ages. We walk in the company of you mothers of the faith who teach us to resist evil with boldness, to lead with wisdom, and to heal. Amen.